This is Frontline News.
Look, I need to tell you about something that happened at the White House 3 days ago that should absolutely terrify anyone who understands how North American security and economics actually work. President Trump held what was supposed to be a routine meeting with Canadian officials about trade adjustments. And according to multiple sources who were actually in the room, that meeting devolved into something so confrontational, so threatening to the fundamental architecture of the US-Canada relationship, that senior Canadian officials left the White House and immediately began contingency planning for what one called the end of the special relationship that has defined North American stability since 1867. And here's what nobody's talking about in mainstream coverage. This isn't just about tariffs or trade disputes or hurt feelings between leaders. What happened in that meeting and what Trump specifically threatened to do strikes at the foundational assumptions that have governed continental security, economic integration, and strategic cooperation for over 2 centuries. We're not talking about renegotiating NAFTA again. We're talking about the potential unraveling of defensive alliances, intelligence sharing agreements, integrated supply chains, and border management systems that touch every single aspect of how North America functions as a unified strategic bloc. Now, before we go any further, I want to be clear about something. You can't really trust mainstream media to explain what's actually at stake here because they're either treating this as another Trump being Trump story or they're focusing entirely on the immediate tariff threats without understanding the deeper institutional relationships that are being put at risk. That's exactly why we built Frontline News, to bring you analysis that goes beyond surface level coverage and actually explains how these systems work, why they were built the way they were, and what happens when you start dismantling them without understanding the consequences. We're not funded by trade associations or political parties that benefit from keeping you focused on partisan narratives. We're here to break down what happens when a president decides to treat America's closest ally, largest trading partner, and most important strategic partner like an adversary, and why the implications go far beyond anything you're hearing in conventional coverage. If you want to stay ahead of incomplete analysis and understand what's really being threatened here, what mechanisms are at risk, and why this matters for continental security going forward, make sure you subscribe to the channel right now. We bring this level of deep institutional analysis every single day, explaining how international relationships actually function versus how politicians talk about them. Just hit the subscribe button below to join this community. And if you believe in analysis that treats these alliances as serious strategic infrastructure rather than bargaining chips, this is your moment. Subscribe. Drop a comment with your thoughts on whether the US-Canada relationship can survive this kind of treatment. And let's build something that demands understanding of how geopolitics actually works. All right, let's get into what happened and why it matters so much more than you're being told. So here's what we know about the meeting itself. And I want you to pay attention to the specific details because they tell you everything about how badly this went. On February 4th, 2026, a Canadian delegation arrived at the White House for what Ottawa had been told would be a working-level discussion about minor tariff adjustments and regulatory harm, the kind of technical talks that happen constantly between the US and Canada to keep the world's largest bilateral trading relationship functioning smoothly. The Canadian side included the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Trade Minister, and 3 senior officials from the Privy Council Office, which is essentially Canada's equivalent of the National Security Council. That's a serious delegation, but not unusual for this kind of discussion. What was unusual was what happened when they arrived. According to sources familiar with the meeting, Trump kept the delegation waiting for 47 minutes, which in diplomatic terms is a deliberate insult, then entered the room with his trade representative, national security advisor, and notably, Stephen Miller, whose presence at a trade meeting with Canada raised immediate red flags for the Canadian side, because Miller's portfolio has nothing to do with trade and everything to do with immigration enforcement and border security. The meeting was supposed to last 1 hour. It lasted 23 minutes. Here's what multiple sources say happened in those 23 minutes. Trump opened by stating that Canada has been ripping off the United States for decades, that the trade deficit with Canada, which he claimed was over $100 billion, was unacceptable, and that unless Canada agreed to immediate and substantial concessions, he would implement emergency tariffs of 25% on all Canadian imports within 48 hours. Now, there are multiple problems with this opening that the Canadian delegation immediately recognized. First, the U.S. does not have a $100 billion trade deficit with Canada, depending on how you calculate it. The US actually runs a small surplus with Canada in goods and services combined, or a modest deficit in goods alone that's offset by a significant surplus in services. Second, 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports would violate USMCA, the trade agreement that Trump himself negotiated and signed in 2020 to replace NAFTA. Third, and this is what really alarmed the Canadian side, Trump didn't present this as an opening negotiating position. He presented it as a decision that had already been made unless Canada capitulated immediately to demands that he hadn't actually specified yet. The Canadian Deputy Prime Minister, according to sources, attempted to clarify the trade balance figures, pointing out that when you include services, energy, and integrated supply chains where parts cross the border multiple times during manufacturing, the relationship is essentially balanced and mutually beneficial. Trump reportedly cut her off and said, "I don't care about your math. I care about American workers." Then he said something that absolutely shocked everyone in the room. He stated that if Canada didn't agree to his terms, he would not only implement the tariffs, but he would also begin requiring Canadian citizens to obtain visas to enter the United States. He would withdraw U.S. participation in NORAD command integration. And he would instruct border officials to begin treating the Canadian border with the same level of scrutiny as the Mexican border, including potential deployment of National Guard units. Let me pause here because if you don't understand what each of those threats means institutionally, you can't grasp how devastating they would be. We're going to break down each one. But first, understand this. Trump wasn't threatening to renegotiate terms of the relationship. He was threatening to dismantle the entire institutional framework that has governed North American integration for generations. Wait, it gets better, or actually much worse, depending on your perspective. After Trump delivered these threats, Stephen Miller apparently took over the conversation and began discussing what he called security vulnerabilities at the Canadian border. He claimed that terrorists and criminals were flowing across the northern border unchecked, that Canada's immigration system was allowing dangerous individuals into North America who then accessed the United States, and that the US could no longer afford to treat the Canadian border as a trusted partnership. Now, this is where you need to understand some critical context that mainstream media isn't explaining. The US-Canada border operates under a completely different security framework than any other American border. It's not an open border, despite what some people think, but it is a border managed through deep intelligence sharing, coordinated law enforcement, pre-clearance agreements, and institutional trust built over decades. When Miller started talking about treating it like the southern border, he was essentially saying that entire framework of trust and coordination was over, that Canada would now be treated as a potential threat rather than as the integrated security partner. It has been since the Second World War. The Canadian delegation, according to multiple sources, was stunned into silence for several seconds. Then the foreign minister asked a direct question, and I'm paraphrasing based on what sources described. But the essence was this. Are you telling us that the United States is prepared to end intelligence sharing agreements, withdraw from integrated defense structures, and treat Canadian citizens as security threats unless we agree to trade terms that violate the agreement your administration negotiated? Trump reportedly responded that he would do whatever was necessary to protect American interests, and that if Canada didn't like it, they were free to find other partners. The meeting ended shortly after that with no agreement, no follow-up scheduled, and according to sources, with Canadian officials leaving the White House in what one described as controlled shock. Now, here's what I discovered researching the institutional frameworks that Trump was threatening. And this is where you start to understand why what seemed like a hostile negotiating tactic is actually something much more serious. Let's start with NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, because this is probably the most important thing most Americans don't understand about continental defense. NORAD isn't just a defense agreement. It's an integrated binational command structure where U.S. and Canadian forces operate under unified command to defend North American airspace. It was created in 1958 during the Cold War because both countries recognized that you cannot defend North American airspace with a border running through the middle of your defensive perimeter. Soviet bombers and missiles didn't care about the border, so neither could North American defense. NORAD headquarters is at Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado, but the alternate command center is at Canadian Forces Base North Bay in Ontario. Canadian CF-18 fighters intercept threats in American airspace. American F-22s intercept threats in Canadian airspace, all under integrated command where nationality of the aircraft is irrelevant to the mission. Here's what makes Trump's threat to withdraw from NORAD integration so staggering from a defense perspective. The entire architecture of North American air defense is built on the assumption of seamless integration. Radar systems, communication networks, response protocols, all of it is designed around the principle that there is one airspace, one command structure, one defensive perimeter. If you start separating that back into two national systems, you don't just create inefficiency, you create gaps. You create seams in coverage where threats can exploit the boundary between two separate systems that are trying to coordinate but aren't integrated. Every defense expert who has looked at North American aerospace defense has concluded the same thing. Integrated command isn't optimal. It's necessary. And any attempt to separate it would leave both countries more vulnerable than they were in 1958 before. NORAD was created. So when Trump threatens to withdraw from NORAD integration, he's not threatening to reduce cooperation with Canada. He's threatening to make North American airspace fundamentally less defensible, and he's doing it apparently without any understanding of why the system was built this way in the first place. But it gets even more complex when you look at the intelligence sharing relationships. And this is what kept me researching late into the night, because the depth of integration is something most people, including apparently Trump, have no idea exists. The United States and Canada are part of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, along with the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. This is the most integrated intelligence sharing arrangement in history, where signals intelligence, human intelligence, cyber intelligence, all of it flows between partners with almost no restrictions. But the US-Canada intelligence relationship goes even deeper than Five Eyes because of geographic proximity and shared threats. The two countries share real-time intelligence on threats to critical infrastructure, on potential terrorist activity, on cyber attacks, on border security, on everything that touches continental security. Canadian intelligence services have access to some US systems that even close NATO allies don't access, and vice versa, because the integration is built on the recognition that threats to one country are threats to both. Here's a concrete example of why this matters. When there's a potential terrorism threat in Canada, say intelligence suggests someone might be planning an attack in Toronto, US intelligence agencies share everything they have immediately because they know that instability in Canada is a direct threat to US security. When there's a threat in the United States, the reverse happens. This isn't charity, it's recognition of a shared security perimeter. If Trump starts treating Canada as a potential adversary rather than a trusted partner, that entire system of automatic intelligence sharing has to be Canadian intelligence officials would have to start asking, if we share information about a threat with the Americans, could that information be weaponized against Canadian interests? The system depends on trust that both sides are operating from a foundation of shared strategic interest. Remove that foundation, and you can't just reduce intelligence sharing to a lower level of cooperation. You have to fundamentally restructure it with all the delays, gaps, and vulnerabilities that creates. And then there's the visa requirement threat, which sounds like a minor administrative change, but would be economically catastrophic. Right now, Canadian citizens can cross into the United States with a passport or enhanced driver's license for most purposes. And the same is true in reverse for Americans entering Canada. This isn't because the borders are undefended. It's because both countries have determined that the benefits of facilitated travel dramatically outweigh the security risks, and that security concerns can be managed through intelligence sharing, coordination, and targeted enforcement rather than blanket restrictions. Requiring Canadians to obtain visas to enter the US would mean every Canadian who wants to visit, conduct business, or transit through the United States would need to apply for a visa in advance, pay fees, possibly attend an interview, and wait for approval. The administrative burden would be massive. The US State Department currently has capacity to process roughly 10 million visa applications per year across the entire world. Canada alone generates about 20 million border crossings per year for business purposes, plus millions more for tourism, family visits, and transit. Let me show you something that reveals just how integrated the two economies are and why a visa requirement would be devastating. The Detroit-Windsor border crossing, which connects Michigan and Ontario, is the busiest commercial land border crossing in North America. Approximately 8,000 trucks cross that border every single day, carrying about 25% of all US-Canada trade. Many of those trucks are driven by Canadian citizens who currently can cross quickly with commercial documentation. If those drivers suddenly needed visas, you would create immediate bottlenecks that would ripple through supply chains on both sides of the border. But it's not just commercial traffic. Think about families that live on one side of the border and have relatives on the other, which is incredibly common in border communities. Think about businesses that have operations in both countries and need employees to travel back and forth regularly. Think about the entire economic model of Canadian cities like Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal, which rely heavily on US business travel and tourism. A visa requirement wouldn't just inconvenience Canadians. It would fundamentally alter the economic integration that has developed over decades. O diferencial mortal: zero dados, zero fontes, zero que tais. É 100% puro pensamento. And here's what really bothers me about Trump's approach to this entire situation. And I want to hear from both his supporters and critics on this. Let's say you believe that Canada has been taking advantage of the United States in trade, which I think is debatable, but let's grant the premise for the sake of argument. Let's say you believe that trade deals need to be renegotiated to benefit American workers more. Fine, those are legitimate policy positions you can argue for. But here's what I can't figure out. How does threatening to dismantle the entire security and institutional relationship with your largest trading partner, closest ally, and most important strategic partner in continental defense actually advance American interests? Because the assumption Trump seems to be making is that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. So threats will force Canadian capitulation. But is that actually true when you look at the strategic realities? Canada is the largest foreign supplier of oil and natural gas to the United States, providing about 4 million barrels of crude oil per day and massive amounts of natural gas, especially to northern U.S. states. If that relationship becomes adversarial, Canada doesn't just lose a customer. Canada potentially gains leverage because U.S. refining infrastructure in the Midwest is specifically designed to process Canadian heavy crude, and replacing that supply quickly would be extremely difficult and expensive. Canada is the largest trading partner for 36 U.S. states, meaning more states trade primarily with Canada than with China, Mexico, or any other country. If you're a governor of Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Minnesota, or any of the other states deeply integrated with Canadian trade, Trump's threats aren't protecting your state's interests. They're threatening them. And here's the part that really concerns me from a strategic perspective. If the United States treats Canada as an adversary, what are Canada's alternatives? This is where Trump's lack of understanding about how modern geopolitics works becomes really dangerous. Canada can't just become independent of U.S. trade overnight. The integration is too deep. But Canada can begin diversifying away from dependence on U.S. markets, and they've already started. Over the past decade, Canada has been negotiating and implementing trade agreements with the European Union, with Pacific nations through CPTPP, with individual countries across Asia and Latin America, all designed to reduce dependence on the U.S. market. Trump's threats don't force Canada back into total dependence. They accelerate Canadian efforts to build alternative partnerships. And here's the kicker. Some of those alternative partnerships are with countries that the United States considers strategic competitors. If Canada feels it can't rely on the United States as a partner, what stops Ottawa from deepening economic and even security cooperation with China? With European powers that are increasingly skeptical of U.S. leadership, with anyone who offers stability that Washington is no longer providing. Let me ask this another way, because I think it gets at something fundamental about how Trump views alliances. If you're a U.S. president and you believe that allies have been taking advantage of American generosity for decades, which again is a debatable premise, but let's grant it, what's your strategy for changing that? Option A is you work within the existing institutional frameworks. You negotiate firmly. You demand adjustments to agreements. You use economic leverage, but you maintain the fundamental relationships because you recognize that those relationships have strategic value beyond immediate economic transactions. Option B is you treat allies like adversaries. You threaten to dismantle the entire relationship unless they capitulate immediately. You signal that you see them as sources of exploitation rather than partners. And you assume that threats will work because you believe you have all the leverage. Trump consistently chooses option B, and we're now seeing what happens when you apply that strategy to the US-Canada relationship. Here's what's happening right now in Ottawa, and this is based on reporting from Canadian media and sources familiar with the government's response. Immediately after the White House meeting, Prime Minister's office convened an emergency meeting of what's called the Incident Response Group, which is basically the Canadian equivalent of the National Security Council during a crisis. That group has been meeting daily since the failed White House meeting. And according to sources They're working through contingency plans that haven't been seriously considered in modern Canadian history. What happens if the United States actually implements 25% tariffs on all Canadian goods? What retaliatory measures can Canada take that would create political pressure on Trump without so damaging the relationship that recovery becomes impossible? What happens if visa requirements are actually imposed? What happens if intelligence sharing is disrupted? What happens if NORAD integration starts to break down? These aren't hypothetical planning exercises anymore. These are active preparations for scenarios that seemed unthinkable 6 months ago. Canadian officials have also reportedly begun reaching out to U.S. governors, members of Congress, business leaders, anyone with influence who might be able to either restrain Trump or at least understand the full implications of what he's threatening. And here's what's interesting about those conversations. According to sources, many American officials, including some Republicans, are hearing about the depth of integration for the first time and are genuinely shocked that Trump would threaten it. There's a bipartisan consensus in Congress, at least among people who actually understand the relationship, that the U.S.-Canada alliance is fundamental to American security and prosperity. But there's also recognition that Trump doesn't care about institutional consensus, and that if he's determined to blow up the relationship as a negotiating tactic, there may be limited ability to stop him before serious damage is done. International allies are watching this situation very closely, and this is where the implications go way beyond U.S.-Canada relations. If the United States is willing to threaten its closest ally, most integrated partner, and most reliable friend with diplomatic and economic destruction over relatively minor trade disputes, what does that signal to other allies? If you're Japan, South Korea, Australia, NATO members in Europe, what do you conclude about the reliability of American commitments? The entire post-World War II international order that the United States built was based on the principle that America is a reliable partner that honors its commitments, even when short-term interests might suggest otherwise. That reliability is what made the US-led order attractive to countries that could have chosen other alignments. If reliability is gone, if every relationship is purely transactional and subject to disruption based on presidential whims, why would any country invest in deep integration with the United States when that integration creates vulnerability to sudden American policy changes? Let's talk about what the specific economic impacts would be if Trump actually follows through on these threats. Because I think this is where you can see most clearly that he either doesn't understand or doesn't care about how integrated supply chains actually work. 25% tariffs on all Canadian imports means 25% tariffs on the oil and natural gas that heat homes and power industry in northern U.S. states. It means 25% tariffs on Canadian lumber. That's essential for U.S. housing construction. It means 25% tariffs on Canadian aluminum that goes into American manufactured goods, on Canadian auto parts that are essential to Detroit's manufacturing, on Canadian agricultural products that fill grocery stores across the U.S. In each case, the tariff doesn't just make the Canadian product more expensive. It ripples through entire supply chains because modern manufacturing isn't about finished goods crossing a border once. It's about components crossing multiple times as products are assembled. Here's a concrete example that shows how this works. The automotive industry in North America is completely integrated across the US-Canada border and increasingly the Mexican border as well under US. A typical car assembled in the United States contains parts from all three countries, and those parts might cross borders multiple times during the manufacturing process. Canadian steel gets shipped to Michigan, where it's stamped into body panels. Those panels go back to Ontario for assembly. The partially assembled vehicle comes back to the US for final finishing, and the completed car is sold in all three countries. If you put 25% tariffs on Canadian components, you're not just taxing Canadian products, you're taxing American manufacturing that depends on those components. U.S. automakers would face massive cost increases, which they would either have to pass on to consumers or absorb through reduced profits, reduced employment, or both. The executives at GM, Ford, and Stellantis understand this, which is why auto industry representatives have been privately begging the White House not to do anything that would disrupt the integrated North American supply chain. The same principle applies to energy. The United States imported about 3.8 million barrels per day of crude oil from Canada in 2025, making Canada by far the largest foreign oil supplier. Much of that oil goes to refineries in the Midwest that are specifically configured to process Canadian heavy crude. 25% tariffs on that oil would immediately increase costs for those refineries, which would flow through to gas prices for consumers across the Midwest and beyond. Now, Trump might argue that this would encourage U.S. oil production. And that's theoretically true, but you can't replace 3.8 million barrels per day of imports instantly. It takes years to bring new production online, to build necessary infrastructure, to adjust refining capacity. In the short to medium term, tariffs on Canadian oil mean higher energy costs for Americans, which means higher costs for everything that depends on energy, which is basically the entire economy. And here's something that should concern everyone, regardless of whether you support Trump's trade policies. If the United States imposes devastating tariffs on Canada, Canada will retaliate. That's not speculation, that's certainty. Canadian officials have already begun circulating lists of American products that would face retaliatory tariffs. And those lists are carefully designed to maximize political pain for Trump. They target products from states that Trump won or needs to win in 2028. They target industries with political influence. They target congressional districts represented by Republicans who might be able to pressure the White House. Canada did exactly this in 2018 when Trump imposed steel and aluminum tariffs, and it worked. The political pressure from affected industries eventually contributed to the tariffs being lifted. So if Trump goes forward with 25% tariffs on everything, expect Canada to retaliate against American agriculture, American manufactured goods, American services, everything they can target to create maximum domestic political pressure. Now, let me flip the script for a second, because I think this is important. Imagine if a Democratic president had threatened to dismantle NORAD, end intelligence sharing with Canada, and require visas for Canadian citizens over a trade dispute. Would Republicans be defending that? Would they be saying that's just tough negotiating? Or would they be pointing out that you don't threaten to destroy strategic alliances that are fundamental to American security just to gain leverage in trade talks? Because I remember when Democrats suggested even modest reductions in defense commitments to NATO allies, and Republicans correctly pointed out that you don't undermine strategic alliances for short-term political purposes. So why is it different when Trump threatens to undermine the most important bilateral alliance the United States has? Either strategic alliances matter, or they're just transactional arrangements that can be discarded when convenient. But you can't have it both ways. And if you oppose Trump and think his approach to Canada is reckless, let me ask you this. What's your alternative strategy for addressing legitimate trade imbalances and ensuring that trade agreements actually benefit American workers? Because you can't just say Trump is wrong without articulating what the right approach would be. The economic anxiety that Trump is exploiting is real. Manufacturing job losses are real. Communities devastated by outsourcing are real. If your response to Trump's trade war with Canada is just to defend the status quo and insist that free trade is always good, you're not offering a compelling alternative. You're just dismissing the concerns that made Trump's approach politically attractive. So, what's the alternative? How do you protect American workers and communities without destroying the strategic relationships that are essential to American security? Here's the bottom line, and I want to be really clear about this because it matters for everyone, regardless of your politics. The United States and Canada have built over 2 centuries the most integrated, peaceful, and mutually beneficial bilateral relationship in modern history. That relationship is underpinned by deep institutional connections, integrated defense structures, coordinated intelligence sharing, and economic interdependence that touches every aspect of both countries' prosperity and security. President Trump held a meeting at the White House where he threatened to dismantle major components of that relationship, not as a last resort after years of failed negotiations, but as an opening negotiating position on relatively minor trade issues. The Canadian government is now actively planning for scenarios where the alliance that has defined North American stability might not survive this presidency. And the implications go far beyond U.S.-Canada relations, because every ally is watching and asking whether the United States is still a reliable partner or has become a country that treats even its closest friends as adversaries when political advantage suggests it. If Trump actually follows through on his threats, 25% tariffs, visa requirements, NORAD, disruption, intelligence sharing restrictions, we're not talking about a renegotiation of terms within the alliance. We're talking about the potential end of the special relationship that has made North America the most stable and secure region in the world. And if the alliance can't survive this kind of treatment, it's not just Canada that loses. The United States loses its most reliable ally, its largest trading partner, its most important partner in continental defense, and its reputation as a country that honors its commitments. The question now is, whether Trump understands any of this, whether anyone in the White House who does understand it has any ability to influence his decisions, and whether the institutional relationship between the two countries is strong enough to survive this level of abuse. Keep your eyes on this extremely closely, because over the next few weeks, you're going to see whether Trump actually implements these threats or whether they were negotiating bluster that he backs away from once the implications become clear. Watch for Canadian retaliatory measures if tariffs actually go forward. Watch for congressional pushback from members representing states dependent on Canadian trade. Watch for business community pressure from industries that depend on integrated supply chains. Watch for reactions from other U.S. allies, trying to understand what this means for their own relationships with Washington. And most importantly, watch for any signs that someone in the administration actually understands that you can't. Treat your closest ally like an enemy without consequences that go far beyond trade balances. This isn't just another Trump controversy. This is a genuine threat to the foundational relationships that have secured North America for generations. Tell me I'm wrong in the comments. I genuinely want to hear from people who think Trump's approach makes strategic sense and people who think it's reckless. What am I missing about the strategy here?